Morning, chums, and welcome to yet another by royal appointment. It's always lovely to have your company. And as I often say, nothing's confidential on here. And literally, I like to open the palace doors so that we get to see behind the stories that have made the headlines for so long. And what's fascinating, I know I often say this to you, but now I'm lucky enough to meet certain people that have either been there during that pivotal time or indeed have a very wide-ranging view because they were in the vicinity of what went on. And more importantly, ex-staff members that really want to get their side of the events out there because they're now either free from NDAs or indeed simply don't care. Of course, what I like to pass on to you is the fact that this is complete validation because they have proof, they have this stuff. But a lot of them, of course, are waiting to either do a book or indeed want that to be out there in their own terms. So the conversations that I find fascinating are the ones that seemingly now are, what's the word I would say? They're there, aren't they? And people absolutely 100% believe them. With the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, it was a joyous time. At that time, I was doing something every single day just on Harry and Meghan for various channels around the world. Everything from the wedding cake to security protocol to, how to be a princess, all of that sort of stuff. They literally could not get enough of these stories. There was an excitement. There was, goodwill over here in the United Kingdom, despite, of course, what Meghan Markle personally says. Now, what I find fascinating, and I think this was very, very hurtful, not just, of course, to senior members of the British monarchy, but to the late Queen Elizabeth II, was the fact that when Harry and Meghan decided to do this on their Netflix series, the docu-series about how badly they've been treated ever since she came into the most famous family with all the luxuries given free to her in the world. Well, this one really stood out, and I wanted truly to get to the bottom of this. So as ever, let me explain. A lot of people were just stunned by the people that Meghan had invited to the wedding. George Clooney famously sort of, quipped, didn't he, that he didn't know them, but it was a day out. I mean, really terrible when you think. Of course, the cast of Suits came along because they're actors and actresses, and it was a chance to sit alongside the most famous woman in the world, Queen Elizabeth, at an event that they would normally never get invited to. I don't decree any of that. I would do that myself. Absolutely fabulous. There were stalwarts there, of course, like David and Victoria Beckham, that are now put onto the subs benches because, somebody offended Markle, so that's that, right? And then Elton John, ubiquitous at every event like this, but seemingly, of course, even he couldn't rescue Meghan Markle's career with the ill-fated animation thing called Pearl, right? And then you look at this stuff and you kind of think, well, who are these people? And as I told you time and time again, what was odd was the fact that Meghan literally just had her mother. We all thought Thomas Markle was going to make it eventually. I hoped for his sake that he could, seemingly because it was one of the most glorious days of his life to be able to say that he escorted his daughter down the aisle in front of the world, literally at St. George's Chapel in the very heart of Windsor. But for whatever reason, things took a nasty turn for the worst. Now, a lot of people ask me the question, why did the King, or, at the time the Prince of Wales, that is Charles, of course, or the Queen, reach out to Thomas Markle? Well, from an excellent source, I was told that Charles did offer to do that and see what they could do, but that was all shut down, not directly from Meghan, but from Prince Harry, as ever, allegedly. This was because he didn't want her upset any further, the father was ill, no, he had to be trusted on this. This was the deal. But the bigger plot, which was really fascinating, I found, was this. Remember this woman? Ashley Hale, right? Now, she popped up on the docu-series basically saying that she'd been invited to the wedding and she was absolutely delighted to go, which would give Meghan a scorecard of 2 guests that she had from family, her own mother, Doria Ragland, and now Ashley Hale. Now, where it gets really interesting is she goes on camera to basically say that, the palace told Meghan that she had to disinvite her. Well, there were just red flags all around that. I mean, why would the palace say you have to disinvite this woman? Seems pleasant enough, very well-groomed girl, not exactly going to be an embarrassment. She looked nice. She was exactly the sort of look that would have enhanced an event like that. So that was odd in itself. Well, those people that were there literally working at the palace at the time tell me this refutedly is not true. time and time again, and they have this in email documentation to Meghan, that they kept saying, you know, daily updates almost. Is there anybody else that you'd like to invite to the wedding? Now, the reason why they were doing this was not to be, you know, unkind or put pressure on, but this final list had to then be presented to the Queen to make sure that she liked, you know, I don't mean she liked, but, you know, everybody was writing the proper things and all that sort of stuff. But of course, each time, you know, the Queen would say, is there an update? You know, is Meghan invited? No, no, no. So you go back to this particular story, and what I would say if I was Ashley Hale particularly, I would want to know exactly, do you have an email from these people? Was it a phone call? Was it a general conversation? Because something like that would have been put in writing, right? And they have no documentation whatsoever that Ashley Hale was ever going to be invited to the wedding. So something weird along the line looks very, very strange indeed. Now, I'm not out here to create any trouble or anything like that, but I think this poor lady, as I say, clearly missed the opportunity of a lifetime. Surely somebody needs to be honest with her. If that did come from the palace, and this is not the case, exactly who did Meghan or indeed Harry speak to? But seemingly somebody, well, there was no invite because there was no person actually put forward. Interesting. You know, a lot of people ask me, having covered the royal family for many years, what exactly is Prince Harry like? And it's an interesting thing, isn't it, when you look at people of that ilk, as it were, because obviously there's many incarnations. When I first started covering the royal family, Prince Harry was probably, you know, the most fun, if you like, because he had the least problems, you know. He didn't have to worry about the way he was perceived. He was the fun person, the one that could have a giggle, the one that could possibly say the wrong thing at the wrong time. You know, that's really how it played out. Of course, as we've seen over the years, now, of course, the character that he claimed that he was very good at, he didn't necessarily like. But he's spoken about that openly, hasn't he, in those sort of mental health podcasts and stuff like that, basically saying he struggled with his inner role. And it's odd, isn't it, when you think, because how could he have possibly struggled when you also look at the fact of all the help that would have been around him? Of course, contradiction once again in term, because of course his wife at the time said that there was no help given to her. Yet His Majesty the King, the Prince of Wales at the time, King Charles, gave literally tons of help, his own time, and took, of course, time out from all of those royal duties, seemingly to just help his youngest son. But really, is it farther sort of deeper than that when you look? Because what's interesting talking to people who literally worked around our late brilliant monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, what was fascinating was to find the parenting skills behind the throne, as it were. Now, lots of people, if you remember, particularly my generation, I remember when the Duke of Edinburgh, who is, of course, to all of us of a certain age, Prince Edward, joined the Marines, and he hated it. You know, if you remember, absolutely loathed it. And behind the scenes, you know, Prince Philip was furious that he sort of bulked out of it so quickly, seemingly didn't put that much effort in. Well, you know, but actually a lot of people had more sympathy for him because he was the first royal rebel, as it were, to say, I don't want to do this. This is not for me. This is not what I want to do. This is not the role that I want to have. And so obviously he wanted a role in the arts moving forward, stint working for Andrew Lloyd Webber, you know, all that sort of stuff. But ultimately that was, at least he'd said what he wanted to do. Now, as I say, talking to people behind the scenes, what's fascinating is literally the way that the parenting skills were shaped up. Right from the off, if you remember, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, didn't necessarily want to have the name that was going to be presented. He thought, of course, they could be Mountbatten, you know, simple as that. That was the role of the name that he decided to take on. But consequently, there had to be a compromise. This was all down to the Queen Mother. Very formidable woman, the Queen Mother, let me tell you. And moving forward, what was fascinating here was their parenting skills took off. And as we know himself, you know, Charles has been critical of his own mother regarding his upbringing. As the years have gone on, he's realised just how difficult that role, particularly in that era, ladies, for a young woman to be a mother and a monarch. Nobody else was doing it at that level, you know, still very young, still in her 20s, you get the picture. But you see, what a lot of people are suggesting is, was His Majesty the King too soft regarding Prince Harry. Well, all of the sort of scrapes and dramas and everything that I know about behind the scenes, he tried his very best. And the problem that you had with Charles was, in fact, some people might say he was too soft. Now, this was the difference between Prince Philip and King Charles, and you wonder if this is the reason behind why Harry partly is the way that he is. Some might say a determined attention seeker. You get the picture. Now, what happened, you see, was the Queen apparently was the fun, easygoing one. You know, the one that would let them get all their toys out at any time of the day, the one that had time for them to be the fun person. There was a lot of pent-up parenthood there, right? She'd been on these big tours and suddenly she could do things that she wanted with her own children. Now, Philip, totally different, very much a disciplinarian, you know, shoes polished, up at this time, regimental, liked to do certain things at a certain point. And Charles has spoken about that. They had a very fractious relationship growing up, as did, of course, Prince Edward. Prince Andrew seemingly escaped all of that. Princess Anne was definitely much more in line with her father, and you can see that. Regimented, on time, show up, no fuss. That's, I think, why she's so popular. Prince Andrew, as we know, a difficult sort of character to say the least, was given something of a free rein behind the scenes. And what was more problematic on that was simply the fact that not only was it problematic, it was the fact that now, as you can see, he's been very difficult to manage in the future. And according to a source, Prince Philip warned the Queen about this, even though they got on incredibly well. Philip got on incredibly well with all of his children. And over the years, they saw a better side to him, one might suggest, a different side. They understood the reasons behind the way that he did parenting. Of course, Charles wanted to be different, and he was. And under the tutelage and guidance of a much younger Princess Diana, it was her that said, you know, let's relax the reins, let's do this. And consequently, what you can see are two very different children in both William and Harry. And many people are now suggesting behind the scenes, of course, that King Charles literally was perhaps too lax with his youngest son. You'll notice that Prince William has never openly attacked him in public or indeed had any sort of discord with him. Yes, they had their moments, as all fathers and sons do. But really, on this scale, there was nothing like this. And this, according to a source, was very, very much unprecedented and rather shocking to the late Queen. She couldn't quite believe just how cruel Harry could be against his own father. Because let's not forget, the Queen and King Charles, mother and son, and she loved him dearly, no matter what their differences were. To have this broadcast literally left her completely bereft, as one can imagine. It can't really be called a success, can it? You know the sort of thing I'm talking about. It's not necessarily about the ratings or, in fact, the column inches that this particular show garnered. We're talking, of course, chums about With Love, Meghan. And it really did garner a lot of headlines for many days. But of course, it's very difficult now as the aftermath falls behind. And the bigger picture that you have, let me tell you, is the people that are now left working with Meghan Markle. You see, what's happened behind the scenes is that, you know, normally after an event like that, it's like an opening night, you would then present the best of the critics. But sadly for Meghan, universally, the critics have come out in, you know, complete disarray. Even The Economist, that she reads and apparently likes and is very, very sort of keen on as a weekly thing to read, well, they came out and slated her, as did, of course, Time magazine and the expectors like The Hollywood Reporter, The Cut, everybody that she's had a previous association with. The telling point is that they're not on her side. Now, it's fascinating, this is a moment of psychology, because if you've done an interview with somebody and you think it's gone well, you would have expected that publication to still be on your side a little bit, you know, whether not necessarily Vanity Fair, but you know what I'm saying. You know, The Cut, really, that fell apart. Every single thing they've touched, for some explicable reason, she can never go back to. Even Vogue was a little bit, shall we say, light. It's only the tabloids, the terrible tabloids that Meghan Markle claims that she dislikes and don't really exist in America, like People magazine and Us Weekly, that are gushing because they know that that gets sales and they will keep going and pandering until even they decide to turn against her. But behind the scenes, the people, as I say, that are left with Meghan, which I find must be very, very daunting, is that they were literally running through a plethora of ideas that they thought they could help promote With Love Meghan with. Now, you see, you've got to remember that Meghan's ego is so big that basically you're not allowed to suggest anything other than what she fancies. But they know that they're dealing with a 40-odd-year-old woman with a very fragile ego, and an ego that's been stoked all along her life, really right down from her father, Thomas Markle, currently to her husband number 2, which is, of course, the Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry. Nobody dares say this is not a good idea. So Meghan's idea of introducing her children via Instagram, well, you know, that got a round of applause in a meeting, right? Because they thought, well, at least that can't go wrong. People won't attack the children. The story about Guy the Beagle, very nice. But one that really hit the buffers very, very quickly, and this was from a very young person working in there, was they thought that Meghan, now she's returned to Instagram with over 2 million followers, how about doing something that she'd seen herself, which was very useful to the branding and marketing of someone, and doing an Insta Live. That's an Instagram Live, chums. I say that because, you know, we don't know, do we? And the thing is, Insta Live is where you literally go live and then you take questions from the world, you know, at an agreed time, and you announce it and you promote it. And this is really a good way, you know, particularly if you're a pop star like, say, Kylie Minogue or Madonna or somebody like that, to connect with the fans. And yes, you can sift through the good and the bad of the questions, but they have to be up on screen. You can put them up on screen, but you could hide them, a little like Meghan's done with the comments, that she won't allow anybody to do that. Well, this apparently went down like a lead balloon. You know, no, she couldn't do that, not her, because do you know who you're dealing with? You know, this is Meghan Sussex now. This isn't just some micro celebrity, and they couldn't control the narrative. And of course, if somebody asks a question, it's very telling, isn't it, if you're reading it out loud or live on air, that actually you're not sure what it means or where you can go. We saw that with Drew Barrymore, if you remember, when she said, tell me something about your husband, you know, and that sort of stuff, and your children. The only thing she could think of was the word zebra. She never sort of said, oh yes, they have the same sense of humour, or he's, you know, into football, or my daughter loves all things British and was very keen to learn about an historical woman, i.e. a family member, the Queen, 70 years on the throne. No. It was just something, you know, frivolous. It had to be that because she couldn't really think of anything because it's never gone through her mind. Why would you want to know about anything other than Meghan? You see what I'm saying? So moving forward now, the problem that they have as Series 2 is gearing up is to now find anybody who's willing to take on this woman, albeit for a small chat or a magazine interview, because clearly the last ones are becoming very tedious. People magazine was like an oil slick. Everything was agreed and everybody knew. The questions people really want to know is, do you read some of the online comments? What about the alleged pregnancies? Where are we with that? Do you want to respond? That's what people really want to ask. And I think this would be the breakthrough moment for Meghan to address those online stories, because that really would make it authentic, more realistic, and people might then want to connect, or indeed at least try to connect with her. But Meghan wants to present this veneer that basically says, this is the world and I'm not letting you into it any further. And it's as fake as the house, as the bees, as the fruit, as everything that she's doing, but it's the way that she wants to present it. And according to a source working inside that mansion, that's why it's never going to be a success. What she's presenting is not a reality. And if you don't believe me, watch how she slipped up when she said, whoever's looking after them. She didn't say Harry first. She slipped up because everybody knows that Meghan has only really time for one thing, and that truly is herself. Either way, it's going to be fascinating to see what and who, and yes, really, who is willing to now want to go down this route to help promote this fake second series of, as ever, Meghan with Love. This was cited as one of the biggest reasons, well, the big fallout, of course, between Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and, of course, the royal family. And of course, when you look at this story, you can understand why this probably is one of the worst elements of the Megxit, the story, whatever you want to call it, because this was a sit down with Oprah Winfrey. But what a lot of people don't know is this. Let me explain. Now, what happened, you see, when we saw that particular, interview, everybody was focusing on the bombshells, as they call them, the race bombshells that Harry, if you remember, didn't refute, but didn't back up either. But according to a source who worked on the programme for Harpo Productions, he wasn't there for a lot of those questioning. And you have to remember that. He joined her at a certain point. Now, that was part of the deal, according to that source who was working on the programme, who now no longer works for that particular production company. Meghan insisted on being interviewed on her own because she wanted to tell her side of the story. Of course, Harry had no idea what that side of the story was. They didn't have control over the editing or indeed the final, outcome of that programme. The reason being is that they'd signed away, basically signed everything away like they did with Netflix. But the difference with Netflix was that they were supposedly executive producers. So no matter how bad As Ever or With Love Meghan is, what you have to remember is it's her name on the credits, right? So she had the final say how bad that programme was. And I'm not being unkind. If you put your name on it, you have to be responsible for it. But cast your mind back to the Oprah Winfrey. You see, at that particular point, which was incredible when you think, there we have the Queen silently trying to nurse her husband, who is silently very, very ill. We were told many different things. Obviously, royal watchers get told certain bits, and we knew just how bad it truly was. Sadly, when he came back from hospital for the last time, it was very apparent, and you could only imagine how difficult the Queen felt at that point. I remember a few years prior to that, when the Queen was attending an event at the BBC, and at the time the Duke of Edinburgh was in hospital. This is, a few years ago, not many, 5-6 years ago, something like that. And the thing was, I remember somebody asking her, how's the Duke? And she just dismissed it. You'll be fine, it's fine, it's fine. She didn't want to talk about it because I was told, according to sources, that the Queen just believed he was going to go on forever. And she willed that, and that was the problem. So you can understand, at the point of this programme going out, this was not only distressing because behind the scenes we had His Majesty the King, the Prince of Wales at the time, and everybody else in the family truly knowing what was happening, but trying to be supportive. Now, Harry knew just how ill the Duke of Edinburgh was. He had been informed of that. He was aware of that. Now, what's really interesting is this. You see, behind the scenes, they were very concerned at Harpo Productions, the Oprah Winfrey Company, as to what was going to happen, because could the programme be pulled? Now, as I told you before, the bigger problem with a programme like that, it's not about pulling the programme, it's about the sponsors and the time scale of where that is. You see, in the schedule, they may have whatever they're promoting at that point, so they need to be sure that they can get their revenue. And that whole sort of, thing collapses if you don't stick to the plot, the original date. As we saw recently with Meghan shifting her thing allegedly because of the LA fires, it's possibly worked out a little bit better because now, the inauguration is out the way, the fights have sort of died down, and she knew she wouldn't get as much exposure with the tragedy that was the LA fires. You see how this works. Now, here's the bombshell. According to that source who worked with Harpo Productions, the Sussexes, whatever you want to call them, Harry and Meghan, did have that option. And according to that source, Oprah Winfrey's team were very much open to the fact that this would look bad. They realised that this wouldn't paint a great picture. More so for them. Television can be brutal, but even she realised, according to the source, that this could backfire on her. There you are, putting out this particular programme at the very height of this terrible situation that's engulfing the royal family. Most people knew. But apparently, according to the source, they both unified and said, no, we'll just go ahead with it. Now, obviously, the Queen, as we know, was very hurt and upset. And in a very strange way, never known for doing this, she had to get the palace and basically put out a statement to say the infamous line now, recollections may vary. Meghan apparently didn't really care about that because she was fuming about the fact that, where the origin of that had come from. But truly, it was her story and she wanted it out there. She'd lost everything, the passport, her name, all of those things, remember. So when you think about that now and you look at that particular element and you do think to yourself, well, that was terrible what they did. According to the source, and as ever, I have to say, allegedly, well, Harpo were willing to bend the rules. I mean, there was never a good time to put this out. Let's be honest, it was all going to be negative. But it could have been at a period, maybe 6 weeks down the line. Now, as Meghan famously said, and this is an interesting point as well, whatever she does, there's never a right time because the family, the colossus that is the royal family, there's always some drama going one day to the next. And as far as she was concerned, when would it ever go out? And it's a little bit like a TV show, as ever, Meghan. Is there ever a right time? Would she have ever got any better press? Probably not. But this really, when you look at the bigger picture of how negative that whole story was going to be, given that the Duke of Edinburgh was literally in his last days, well, it's very hard to take, isn't it? And once you get the bigger picture of even the TV company thinking this might look bad, well, if they're thinking it looks bad, you might have sat up and thought, maybe I should take notice. But as ever, no. As many people know, there isn't much that Meghan Markle simply can't do. Well, in fact, that's the thing that she likes to tell not just herself, but literally everybody. She's done this, she can speak a language, she's had X jobs, she was almost working from the time she could walk. Everything has a dramatic sort of effect to it, It's almost like the failure of yourself that you haven't achieved enough in your life, because look at what Meghan's done, When she took to the stage, if you remember, in Colombia and said those few words, everybody was like, oh, wow, And I thought, well, if you've learned that language, that shouldn't be such a big factor. But she wanted that moment, didn't she, for everybody to sort of say, you're terrific, you've done so well, you've learnt the language. And Harry, of course, applauding a little bit like a seal next to her. That's his now role. But you see, Meghan, if you remember, had this sort of disaster, which has now been brushed under the carpet, very much so. And here's where it gets interesting. Now, if you recall back just ahead of Prince Harry's book Spare, Penguin Random House had to do a deal with Meghan Markle if they wanted Spare. That was part and parcel of the contract, according to an excellent source, and as ever, allegedly. And what we had was a thing called the bench. Now, this was pushed and pushed and pushed around for ages, and it was going to be marvellous, and, everybody was going to be stopping in their tracks, all of that sort of stuff. Now, I'm not knocking her for that. To write a book is very hard. It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of pre-thought, and you've got to work out exactly how you're going to do it. But you see, as ever with Meghan, it fell short and very thin on ideas, because when you look at it, there wasn't really much there, was there? And nobody really knew what the bench was about, as I've often said. Was it a children's book? Was it a, I don't know, what message was it meant to be? And the only thing that people took away from the book was the pump, pump, pump or something of the heart. And then, of course, the drawings that had to look like Prince Harry coming back in army fatigue gear. She never misses a trick to pander to the ego of the person in that moment that she's looking for. As we all know, the bench really just did not have the desired effect that Meghan wanted. Of course, it got into the New York Times bestseller list, and everybody knows exactly how those things operate, particularly in the book world. If we give you the book and you take the sales away, and I'm not suggesting that for a moment, but I know exactly how the book publishing world works. It's called further fetch, and if you really want the big book, which of course would be Prince Harry's Spare, then you're willing to stop the other. You get the picture. But moving forward, then this happened, because this particular story really stems from the story that came out in Vanity Fair earlier this year, all regarding that apparently associates of Meghan Markle were shopping around a book on a potential divorce. Now, I'm not so sure whether I've ever really believed that, because I think Meghan would want to operate that herself. Obviously, she has acolytes that will go out and tap on doors and test things, but to actually physically say to a publisher, if she was to write a book about divorce, that's a very strong line. However, no stone unturned in the world of Meghan Markle. But you see, after the bench, she was buoyed on by this particular idea of being an authoress, suddenly seeing herself a little bit like a modern day Enid Blyton, Agatha Christie, or whatever, Germaine Greer. She saw that people were going to take her seriously. And this is the problem that Meghan has. And I'm not picking on her personally. I've seen this with a lot of fading celebrities. They want to be taken seriously. People have to notice them, and they want to be noticed for what they've delivered. So the idea that Meghan came up with next, which one was, a strange thing in itself, the working title for this was simply called Paper Cuts. And this really would be where Meghan herself undertook looking at all the big headlines from various newspapers and publications around the world, reading their version of events, and then her putting the version that she knew to be her truth next to it, you see? So for instance, the Megxit story, something else about, say, Archie or whatever, and this was the idea. Now, they said to her, right, okay, we kind of get this, but it needed to have a bit of flavour. And the problem with Meghan was there wasn't any flavour. It was very much every story was, this is wrong, this is wrong. There was not a moment in it where, of course, there could be an element that, there might have been an element of truth. Where it really fell down was that they wanted her to have a two-sided, story, if you like, of the bullying claims that had then just emerged at that particular point. But she wasn't having any of that because she believed that actually Her Majesty the Queen would go public with her version of events, and once that had gone public, then she could really put her own paper cuts to that version. You see how this works now? Obviously that didn't work, that didn't happen. But for Meghan, that was the plot, that was the idea. And of course, Penguin Random House, once they got in the bag, Prince Harry's book Spare, they very quickly lost interest in the ramblings of course, a former soap actress. It wasn't what they were looking for. And what's interesting also, the bigger picture was, this was a 4-book deal with Prince Harry. Let's not forget that. That was going to be the big thing, But of course, his ideas, like a little bit like podcasting, of going to interview the Pope, or of course, Putin, or somebody like that, well, they fell through the floor, because he's got really no contacts. And the story actually is that they prefer his stories rather than him interviewing other people. He has no credibility in interviewing anybody else, and naturally that would cost a lot of money because they would have to find somebody to, put the questions together, produce it, ghostwrite it. It's very expensive working with the Markles, as it's called. So for Meghan's idea of a book, it's going to be fascinating because, again, she would need big books for the divorce book. But the Paper Cuts book, even that was going to cost a fortune because you need to get clearance rights to put those stories in the book. And then, of course, basically, you're leaving yourself wide open to all sorts of legalities, because if that writer, reporter, interviewer said, but I've got the proof, it's on tape, well, where'd you go from there? So very quickly, they decided not to paper cut, but to simply cut Meghan.